Hello and welcome. I'm speaking to you today from our beautiful Karuna Institute. I thought this would be the perfect place to talk about some common questions that come up in biodynamics, since this is where we teach craniosacral biodynamics and where much of it has developed. This is the institute that Franklin Sills and his ex-wife Maura Sills have set up. And biodynamics is really, in a way, growing up here. So welcome. This is our seminar room where Franklin and I spend a great deal of time these days. And we're actually here this week teaching a post-grad craniosacral therapy seminar that's on the bioelectric field. And I'm feeling inspired within this field to respond to some questions that have come up they were specifically directed to the field of biodynamics, but in my opinion, they apply to just about everything, all of our relational fields, how we are in relationship with others. And certainly I apply this in my continuum practice and in prenatal and birth therapy and in any kind of therapy. I think this would be useful. So the question is, what is perception? And how do we shift perception? So what comes to mind, first of all, when I have the question, what is perception, presented to me, is I come back to memories of my early training as an occupational therapist. And there we learned about neurological aspects of perception. And what we learned is that perception is how we organize or make sense of the sensations coming into us. So it's not pure sensation. It's about what we do with that sensation. How do we make sense of it? And this is a very relevant question for biodynamics, but also for any relationship. Important in biodynamics, in that many have said that the biodynamic training is really a training in perception. We're learning to shift our perceptual mode from our usual cultural way of seeing things to a much more holistic and wider way of seeing things, wider, deeper way of seeing things. So in our modern Western culture, we are trained to focus in on things, to give them names. If you've ever been with a child about 15 months old, say, everything they want to know is, what's that? What's that? What that? What that? They want the names. They're learning to organize their perceptions in a culturally accepted way. And language helps us to do that. And their brains are at a stage when all that is organizing. It's very important. We need to be able to do that to function in our lives, in our everyday lives. To practice biodynamics, however, we need to be able to deepen and widen, so we're not just focusing in on specifics, focusing in on details. That, to me, that's important also in being with another person. If we want to understand the other person, we need to be able to let go of our usual way of seeing things and be open to what they might be presenting. What might their perception be? What might their world be like? Can we be interested in that? Or are we threatened by it? So that brings us to the question, how do we shift our perception? And we used to teach, and this is what I learned when I was training, to practice shifting awareness or attention from, say, the client to outdoors. So we used to practice, excuse me, orienting to the sense of the client in our hands, their system, their body in our hands, and then once in a while shifting our attention out, so we're looking out the window. Excuse me. And what that helps us to do, to be able to not just stay focused in the details. In biodynamics, we practice being with and perceiving at different levels different subtle rhythms, different what we call tides. So we have what we normally call the CRI, the craniorhythmic impulse, or the cranial impulse, which relates to our conditions in lives. It's like the waves on the ocean. There's a lot of activity, and when we first put our hands on somebody's body, we will tend to sense all these waves, activities, movements back and forth, patterns. And in our modern Western world, we're trained to focus in on that kind of activity. It's faster. It's about our history. It could be about what isn't working, where are the problems. It's what we're trained to look at. In biodynamics, we want to deepen under that. We orient to where the health is, where the aliveness is, the potency is, life energy within the fluids. And what's beyond that, deeper energetic fields and forces. So we learn to settle ourselves and support the client in settling. We learn to widen our field of perception. So it's not just about, oh, what's that moving there? But what is that suspended within? What's the larger field that holds that? And so first of all, there is a cellular tissue field. The cells are all in communication, hopefully in health, with each other. There's a resonance between them. There are tissue fields. Embryology now looks at fields developing, different areas that develop into different kinds of tissues with different functions. And they're communicating between each other. We have the physical body made up of cells, tissues, and the field of the body, the physical body. We have the fluids within that physical body. As we deepen and widen in biodynamics, we begin to sense a larger fluid field or fluid body. When we talk about fluid tide or mid-tide, which is much slower rhythm oriented to a midline. It has a strong sense of midline, just like in the embryo forming. And there's a sense of every cell, every bit of tissue in the body widening out away from that midline and settling back down and in 2 to 3 cycles per minute. At that mid-tide level, there's a sense of potency, that life energy. And that generates this field of the fluid body. That is suspended within a larger tidal body of long tide, a much slower rhythm. Long tide has a lot to do with light and energy. It can feel windy and airy more than fluid. And it's a huge field that supports us. And that is suspended, supported within a foundation of dynamic stillness, an alive and dynamic stillness. Very spacious and alive. Now, if we're focusing in on a particular bone or a particular bit of tissue or a problem, we're going to have difficulty perceiving those deeper, wider fields of the fluid body and the tidal body, the fluid tide, mid-tide, and the long tide, or dynamic stillness. On the other hand, if we're way out there, focused on what's beyond all of this embodied presence, we're more likely to go into a dissociative state where we're not really present. And often the client will be feeling like, where are they? Where did my therapist go? They won't feel our presence. Our relational field dissolves. And you may start to see how this ability to shift our perceptual mode can relate to any relationship, and it's very important in any kind of therapy. So somebody comes in with a problem. If we just focus in on the problem, we join the person in the problem, but where's the resource to help solve that problem? It's said that you can't solve a problem at the level of the problem or with the same kind of perception that you had that created the problem. You need to be able to widen and deepen. So in the biodynamic training, we practice many different ways to deepen under all of our conditioning and to widen our perception. So it's not so much about shifting as our training used to be from CRI, craniorhythmic impulse, to fluid body, fluid tide, to long tide, to stillness, because they're all present. And certainly dynamic stillness and long tide are always present. And they're holding the fluid body, they're holding the conditions and whatever patterns we may have developed in order to manage and compensate for our past experience. So what's helpful, rather than practicing shifting from here to there, so like shifting from my body or the client's body to the sky out the window, is to be able to shift our mode of perception so that we're able to be aware of what's happening within the client and widen our awareness to what is holding that, all that is holding that, how it is held within fields, great space, great energy available. So what happens that enables us to be able to shift our mode of perception? First of all, we encourage our biodynamic students to receive biodynamic sessions because it helps the system to be able to orient in that way. But there are different kinds of exercises that one can do to practice. One is just being in nature. That's one of the reasons I thought it would be interesting to talk about this here at Karuna. Karuna is surrounded by the moors, wide open spaces, quite wild for England, very wild. When I go for walks here, I run into ponies, and the main sounds we hear here are sheep and cows. Occasionally a tractor goes by, but it's very quiet. We hear the wind. We're here with nature and space, and that supports our perception in being more natural and spacious. Babies naturally perceive in this wide, spacious way, and it's said that when they look at you, they're looking at your aura, or they're looking at the energy fields around you. As they start to come into language, they start to learn that that isn't valued and that they need to focus in on specifics. So they lose that ability, but we can come back to it. And one natural way to come back to it, a simple way, is to be in nature. So next time you go for a walk in nature, or if you're not able to get to massive nature like this, go for a walk in a park somewhere, be with a tree. Notice what happens with your sense of yourself and your sense of your relationship with what's around you, your sense of field around you, your sense of support. Many people find nature as a resource because it takes us back to what's prior to our conditions, our history, our trauma. I can't tell you how many of my clients come in, and when I ask them about what supports them in being able to get through whatever has been happening in their lives, they talk about nature and being able to go for walks, being able to sit with their favorite tree or a favorite spot in their garden, whatever it is, being by the river, being by water. All of these things help us remember what's deeper and wider. There are also specific exercises we can do. So something I like to demonstrate in my classes, and this comes up often in continuum classes, because in continuum, we're also learning to deepen and widen, though usually within our own bodies. That's a good starting point. As we start to soften our hold on our own physical patterns in our bodies, we start to be able to perceive more wholeness within ourselves and then around us. So if you imagine sitting in a circle in a class and focusing in on one person in the circle, and I usually demonstrate this by walking up to one person. So I focus in on them, and I point out that when I'm focused in on them, I can't see the rest of the group. I can't perceive easily all of the rest of the whole and all of the resource that's available there, the wisdom and the knowledge and the interesting histories and information that all of these other people bring. If I start to back up, my perception starts to widen. I start to be able to see that one person and the person on either side of them. As I back up more gradually, I see more and more of the whole of the circle. Then it's a practice. We may tend to focus in on that person, focus in on that person, focus in on that thing on the wall or that window or that whatever. But can we widen? We can practice being aware of more and more of the whole. We can do that within our own bodies. If you sense something in your body right now, just let yourself be aware. Have an intention to be aware of your body, your breath, your sense of the support under you, the places where your body makes contact with whatever you're sitting on. And take a moment, let yourself notice what comes to you quickly when you first have an intention to be with your body. And notice if that's familiar or not. Many of us tend to focus on the aches and pains, first of all. And then is it possible to widen your awareness from that? So you become aware of the edges of that area, whatever it is. If it's feeling your breath, do you feel it in one place? Maybe you feel it in your chest. What's the lowest area you can feel it in? Can you feel it down into your diaphragm, down into your belly? How wide does your breath go? How far up does it go? You may find as you're exploring it, your ability to perceive more and more of the whole develops. You perceive more and more widely. You could also practice this on paper. So if you take a piece of paper and draw a dot, or say draw a line, let yourself focus on that dot or line, and then draw dots on either side of the line or the original dot, and practice widening your vision so you can include more and more of the whole. If you're looking at a piece of paper, if you're looking at a window, if you're looking at a wall, can you see the edges of it as well as what's right in front of you, as well as the center? How much of the whole can you see? Now, this is a little bit like you may be familiar with exercises from Gestalt Therapy, where they have figure ground drawings. And the most common one is the drawing of two vases. And if you focus, first of all, you might see, one vase, you might see the vase. But if you shift your perception, you start to see two faces, profiles of faces facing each other. Now, usually it takes people a while to get the one that they didn't initially get. And the more familiar you become with it, the more easily you can shift back and forth. But you may find yourself starting to perceive both at the same time, more of the whole. When I first started studying dance movement psychotherapy, one of the exercises that we did to learn how to be with our client as well as ourselves, because we were orienting to the body, not just to be what was said, not just focusing on what was said, but also the body, our body, and the client's body. We learned to sit with ourselves. Really requires mindfulness to be able to widen our awareness. And first of all, to settle under all of the busyness of our everyday thoughts, the CRI level of conditions and thinking and activity, be able to settle, be aware of what's happening in our own bodies. And then we would have a partner who was in the client role, basically, who would be moving. And we would practice shifting our attention from our own body to the client's movement and coming back. So we go back and forth. We oscillate our attention. Gradually, we'd be able to do that faster. And then we start to sense the field between us, the relational field, which is more like what we do in biodynamics, more of perceiving the whole, where we're sensing our own body, our own midline in biodynamics, our own fields within fields, physical body within the fluid body and its mid-tide, within the larger tidal body of long tide, within dynamic stillness, staying within my midline and that whole wide perception of my own system, I start to widen out to include the client and their midline and their three bodies. And that's a practice that develops over time. We start to have a sense of the relational field between us. We start to have a sense of an interaction between our systems. We start to receive. Once we have a sense and receive perceptions of the client. So once we have a sense of our own system, and we widen to include that of the client, then we let the client's midline be the center of our field of attention, and holding that in a wide field of perception, so that that is suspended within fields that includes us. We're part of what's holding, and we're all held by Mother Earth, and we're all held by a much larger field. Then I start to receive information from the client system. So part of the shifting modes of perception includes being able to widen. It requires being present with ourselves in an embodied way, being able to widen from that, because otherwise we're out there not in relationship. And we may perceive things, but they may not be useful. They may not be what's relevant. My dear mentor, Emily Conrad, who developed continuum movement, used to say that the difference between a madman and a visionary is relevance. So a madman might perceive all kinds of things that aren't relevant. And I've seen many well-meaning practitioners and psychics who perceive all kinds of things and tell the client about them, and the client isn't able to receive it and integrate it. It's very important to be able to be with the client and receive what is relevant for them, to hold that in a kind, unconditionally accepting way. That's where healing can happen. That kind of spaciousness is the kind of field that's needed for healing. A field of presence, a field of potential. And when we widen and deepen, the underlying stillness that holds us all and from which we all emerged can come to the fore and support our journey. So I hope that's helpful in terms of how to be with perception and what is perception, how to shift into modes of perception that are useful, not only in biodynamics, but really in any kind of practice, I believe. So I wish you an amazing perceptual journey. And again, I'd love to hear if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the blog or send me an email. Cherionna at cherionna.com. Thank you.